climate crisis by talking and thinking climatish in a language we developed and learned together. Today, while welcoming UNDP Turkey resident representative Louisa Winton and British ambassador to Turkey Sir Dominic Chirkut, I would like to also welcome all climatists. And today, I am also greeting all who are in front of their screens to think climatishly with us. Welcome once again, dear climateers. Today, all together, we are talking about climate crisis right before the 5th of June, World Environment Day, and towards COP26 or UN Climate Conference to be organized in Glasgow in November 2021. This unique time period we are in is corresponding to the decade of action for global goals, and the decade on ecosystem restoration is officially starting on 5th of June 2021. In other words, it's the last 10 years to shape our future. The change has already started. Climateers are together here today once again. Shall we start? First of all, Louisa, welcome to Turkey. Even though you are new in Turkey, I know that you have vast experience at the global and regional scale under UNDP. As the Goodwill Ambassador of UNDP Turkey, I have been witnessing UNDP's commitment to SDGs and the field works. Could you please share with us your experiences regarding how SDGs and climate crisis intersect and the situation in other countries where UNDP is existent?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the warm welcome. And I have to say, it's a real thrill to be here today to meet you, Mert, our Goodwill Ambassador, and Sir Dominic. It's not every day that you meet two people of such caliber. And thank you. I think Climatish is above all about starting conversations and building partnerships, sometimes unconventional. So I think this activity today is one of many unconventional partnerships that we'll need to forge in order to win the climate battle, as you say. So you asked about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the intersection of the SDGs and climate change. So I wanted to go back a little bit and start with the SDGs, because I think it's something people think they know a lot about, often, sustainable development, but just to say where we're starting from. So the SDGs are really, in sum, our recipe, our collective recipe for a better world. And as you probably know, there's 17 global goals and 169 targets and 247 different indicators. So sometimes it can sound like a very complicated system that the UN has thought up to confuse people and complicate life. But in fact, it's a very, very simple proposition, which is summed up in one phrase, which is to leave no one behind. So the whole idea is to change the world so that we all have equal opportunities, that we all live in prosperity and peace, and that we all live in harmony with our planet. So not at war with nature, but at peace with nature. So this is very important. And these are very, very ambitious goals, the 17 goals. They include eradicating poverty completely, ending hunger completely, eliminating many, many forms of inequality. And the great thing about the global goals is that all member states of the United Nations have agreed voluntarily, without any compulsion, to pursue this agenda and to achieve these goals by the year 2030. So it's very ambitious. It's a very tight timeline. But what everyone needs to remember is these are not UN goals or UNDP goals, but they're goals that every member state has voluntarily taken upon itself to try to achieve. So then the question is, okay, we're already in 2021. We're not, we're well into the decade. We're well into the 15 years that we have to achieve these goals by 2030, but how are we doing? And this is where we hit some problems. So as you mentioned, we have climate change, which is, many of the targets in the global goals are oriented around climate change, and there's an entire goal 13. I carry them with me everywhere so that I know I have a reference. So goal 13 is about fighting climate change and preparing the world for its impact. But we're not doing too well. And we're not doing too well in part because countries aren't dedicated enough to fighting climate change, but also because we're facing, as everyone knows, a global pandemic. So these are standing in our way, and the pandemic in particular, UNDP for 30 years has been measuring the level of human development on the planet. And every year, no matter where there's a crisis or a collapse of markets someplace, every year since 1990, that Human Development Index, that measure, has advanced, has gone up. Last year, unfortunately, was the first time since we started measuring that we've seen a real setback. So COVID has been a drama for everybody. And what I wanted to say, you mentioned this intersection that I think the climate crisis and the pandemic crisis have a lot in common. And in fact, at UNDP, we see common roots to both of them. You know, they're both invisible for a lot of people, that it's very hard for people to understand because they don't see the factors that combine to create the negative impact of climate, but also pandemic. It's invisible. It has no respect for borders. So national solutions are not, you know, enough. There needs to be global cooperation to address the causes. But that said, you know, we need all countries, we need all governments involved. But in both cases, we also need to see individuals change their behavior. To win the fight against the pandemic, we need to see that, but also to win the fight against climate change. We need governments to act, but we need individuals to understand and also to take action. We also see, as I said, common roots. So what's happened? Simply put, humanity has pushed nature too far. We've pushed nature beyond any boundary that it can accommodate. We have upset the balance, and we're pushing the limits. And I think our point today, one of the big points, is that there is no time to waste. You know, as our Secretary General says in the UN, we need to declare peace with the planet today and take action because we have no time. You know, we are running out, and we see this, we'll talk about that. We see it happening, and I think people often don't understand the connection between carbon emissions, the underlying factor behind climate change. But we do see, you know, it's not a future thing. We see it in forest fires. We see it in the drama of forest fires, whether it's the US or Australia. We see it in flash floods. We see it in droughts. And what we see is that these, what we call extreme weather events, are happening not just with greater frequency, but with greater violence, greater impact. And you asked, I've worked in now this is my 4th country assignment, but I've seen commonalities in every place I've worked that underline the urgency. So I was in the country now called North Macedonia for 5 years. In 2015, we had a 1 in 100 year rainfall. So big drama, you know, you had more rain than you ever had in any rain shower. It only comes 1 in 100 years, caused flash flooding, and people died. The next year, 2016, we had a 1 in 1,000 year rainfall. So you say, okay, what is happening? The statistics aren't applicable anymore. You know, it's, and I remember talking to one of the mayors who was most impacted in Macedonia with these flash floods. You know, she said she used to think of rain on the roof as a soothing factor, as something that calmed everyone, put you to sleep. Now when you hear, you know, I think many people who've been through this experience, when you hear rain on the roof, you expect disaster. So I think this is the psychological impact we see from the extreme weather events caused by climate change. I then moved to Georgia, exactly the same thing. 2015, flash floods washed away the Tbilisi Zoo in the capital and killed a number of people. And you had a hippopotamus wandering around the capital. You had a tiger wandering around the capital because it had just come out of the blue and washed everything away. And I think now I'm reading about Turkey. Last year, we saw flash floods along the Black Sea coast in Giresun. And so we see other things, dust storms, hail events, things that we haven't seen before, hundreds and hundreds of climate-related disasters every year. And the statistics show that this is on the rise. This is not the only impact of climate change, but I think it's the most visible. And people sometimes say, well, I can't do anything about the weather. But when we see from science the chain from climate emissions to extreme disasters, then we understand that we need to take action. That's the bad news. But I think from the UNDP perspective, the good news is that we know what to do. In fact, we've known what to do for quite some time. You know, scientists have told us we have the answers. It won't be easy, we know, but at least we have a roadmap to follow on reducing carbon emissions, on shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and on preparing people to face the higher risk of climate-driven disasters and other impacts. The question now is, how do we make sure that we act on this knowledge? And for that, we have the Paris Agreement, we have Global Accord on climate action. But here, I think in the Turkish case, we see this very clearly. We come to the importance of solidarity, that, you know, it's easy to say, okay, these states produced climate, emissions that led to climate change. Other states didn't. Why should those states have to, maybe limit their development prospects to comply with a new idea about carbon? And that's where we come to the equitable burden. We need to see solidarity between countries globally around the world. We need to see countries that played a big role, often more developed countries, in causing climate change, support other countries to meet the demands of climate change. And that, I think, is you find the UN at the very center of that effort, and you find UNDP helping at the country level to provide solutions both on the reducing emissions and on preparing for the threats of climate change. So that's a very long answer to your question, but I did want to say that, we feel very strongly we do have the answers. We have an agreement that binds countries to meet the challenge, and then we need a lot of support from governments and individuals to come together around the solutions.
Güzel ve açıklayıcı cevabınız için
Thank you very much for your comprehensive answer. You have touched upon the 17th goal. For the solution of the problem, we need to sit together and we need to work together. This is one of the goals exciting us the most, because if we can identify a problem, we will be able to take a step towards solution. We are here, thank God we are here, and I would like to also welcome the UK ambassador to Turkey, and I would like to ask my question. We know that climate crisis is the biggest challenge of our time. We know that because we are experiencing its impact in Turkey heavily, also in the world. And also we hear about climate-related disaster news from all around the world every day, such as typhoon, hurricane, drought, fire, which was also, and flood, which was also mentioned during the previous speech, storm, waves of heat and cold. These are very saddening. But as ordinary citizens, we don't know what governments are doing to fight against climate change, or we cannot understand properly. How the UK is handling the situation?
Well, Mert, hoş bulduk, first of all. Thank you for your question. Thank you for inviting me here to talk on this program about the most important issue that we collectively face as humanity, which is saving our planet. You ask about what governments can do and what they should be doing, and I think there are broadly three areas of action that come to mind. Firstly, governments need to show leadership in the discussion of climate change, because actually it's not government action that will make the difference. It's the action of each of us as individual citizens that will make the difference. The choices we make, whether we choose to leave our car in the garage, whether we choose to eat a little bit less red meat, whether we choose to use public transport more often, whether we get on our bicycles, this sort of thing. There are all sorts of choices in our day-to-day lives, the degree to which we use plastic, for example. And it's up to governments to make it clear, not necessarily all the time by legislation or by enforcement, but to make it clear what needs to be done as societies in order to do better by our planet, to use the words of the Secretary General of the United Nations, to make peace with our planet. So I think setting the tone of the debate, showing leadership, is a very important responsibility for all governments. And the British government has made it clear in its publication about Britain's place in the world that the #1 international issue for the British government is going to be combating climate change and biodiversity loss. And that's a very big statement to make in an increasingly competitive world. And I think when a government gives that priority, it sets the tone for the whole nation. And whether you voted for the government or didn't vote for the government, whatever your political point of view, you will take notice of the fact that the government has adopted that position. So that's #1, showing leadership in the debate. #2 is the government can do certain things. It can set targets, for example, for reducing harmful greenhouse gas emissions. And there are two sorts of targets it should be setting. It should be setting a long-term target for reaching what we call net zero emissions. And in the UK's case, we have said that the UK as a country will be a net zero greenhouse gas emitting country by the year 2050. Very ambitious, but it provides the sort of vision then that other policies can fit into. And then we have a shorter term target over 5 years. So for the next 5 years, we have said, we've set a very ambitious target. We will reduce by about 2/3 our greenhouse gas emissions over the next 5 years, which is absolutely enormous. But one thing that what we can say is if you have the right policies in place, you can make significant cuts to greenhouse gases without damaging economic growth. And again, I'm sorry to talk about the UK, but it's obviously the country I know best. But if you look at the last 30 years, the UK's GDP has increased by 75% over those 30 years. At the same time, in the same period, we have reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 43%. So you can make significant cuts in emissions and achieve significant growth at the same time if you get policies right. And that's where the third area comes in that governments can do. They can set a policy framework that provides the right incentives to industry, whether that's in the transport industry or in the construction industry or in manufacturing, wherever it is. The government can set incentives that encourage industry to decarbonize. And indeed, in the UK's case again, the government has recently announced a 10-point plan for what it's calling a green industrial revolution. And there are incentives there for research and development into new technologies, into clean technologies. There are some rather tough measures like a complete ban, a prohibition on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars and lorries after the year 2030. So if you're in Britain and you want to buy an Aston Martin, which I expect is on your shopping list, you won't be able to buy a petrol Aston Martin after the year 2030 in the UK because all petrol vehicles, the sale of new petrol vehicles will be forbidden by then. And also, we are also going to end the use of coal for electricity generation, which is another huge step, given that for a long time, coal was the source, the fuel source that powered British industry. So the move away from coal is another big move. So it's these kind of really revolutionary changes in policy that it is the government's responsibility to adopt in a smart way that continues to allow for the economy to grow in new, clean, green directions in order to achieve the very stretching targets that we must impose on ourselves if we're going to limit global warming and take effective action against climate change, which unfortunately, as Louisa has already pointed out, as humanity, we are not achieving yet.
Gerçekten samimi ifadeleriniz.
Thank you very much for your sincere answer. It's a great source of excitement for all, and it's very inspiring. Your answer is very inspiring. I muted myself accidentally, sorry for that, so I wanted to repeat. I'd like to continue. As you also mentioned, climate crisis is a systematic shock on humanitarian development. As human beings, we have managed to survive after major crises throughout history. So why is climate crisis so important while we are already encountering big challenges such as political unrest, violence against women, poverty, and economic problems? What is our biggest hope to deal with the climate crisis? Why the climate crisis is so important? My question is for our resident representative of UNDP.
Yes, thank you so much. It's really, I think this is something that Sir Dominic was addressing, and very clearly, how does a government like the British government decide that climate is the top priority in a world that is so complicated and so full of challenges, so many crises, so many difficult situations everywhere? How do we wind up with climate change at the top of our, I mean, very high at the top of our list? And I think it's huge. It sets a hugely positive example, this government prioritization. I think also we're in a very difficult time now because we've been in pandemic for a long time. We've seen the damage to the economy, the damage to development gains, and we've seen how tired people are, so that now with vaccinations coming, we see people saying, okay, I have been through enough. I just want to get back to normal. And I think part of our challenge too is how do we convince people that, it's not going back to business as usual before the pandemic, that there is no way back to that, that we need to sort of redouble our efforts and focus on climate change. So why, and how? And I think one answer is that really we have no time to waste, as I said. And I like to quote the Secretary General because he has all sorts of nice phrases, but he's just said, if we want a green planet, we all need to be on red alert. And I think this can't be overemphasized, that we're at 11:59 on the global survival clock. We see the numbers becoming worse and worse, much faster than experts expected. So this is the last minute to take action to save us from this threshold that we've been warned about. So that's one reason why climate needs to be at the top. But also, I think what we need to do is understand that climate change and its consequences, but also the destruction of our biodiversity, one symptom of which is the pandemic, that these are all influenced by climate change. So that if we understand that, for example, I was surprised to read that weather-related crises have triggered more than twice as much displacement as conflict and violence over the last decade. That's from our colleagues at the Refugee Agency of the United Nations. So climate change is driving refugee crises in the world, even more so than conflict and war. We have climate driving food insecurity in countries, creating famines. We have climate promoting or prompting political and social unrest. So that everything is connected, but if you try to pull the lines back to the ultimate cause, I think you have to see climate change almost everywhere. So those two factors, I think, justify putting climate change at the top, that in solving climate change, we can unlock solutions for other issues. And for sure, we need to have greater ambition. This is another reason why the UK is setting such a good example in setting hugely ambitious targets, is that if one big economy shows that it's possible to say, okay, 2/3 reduction in 5 years, then we need others to follow suit. And I know our Secretary General is pushing very hard to have all countries declare net zero commitments at this, the upcoming summit in Glasgow. So you ask, where is hope? And I think by definition, if you work in the United Nations, you are a hopeful and optimistic person. And these are very dire challenges. But I take my hope, first of all, from science and technology. And I think we've seen a vindication of science in the pandemic, in the development of vaccines. And I think if you look back a year ago, nobody expected us to have vaccines at this time. There was a sense of, years and years and years. And we see in less than a year, of course, the vaccines will take time to get out, but we've seen that our scientists have brought us this solution to the pandemic. I think we have to, I hope that success has had a sort of also an effect on the way people look at climate change, that they're more inclined to trust the science and follow the prescriptions that we hear from science. Second factor for hope, and I think Sir Dominic has touched on it, is, we don't need to sacrifice growth. We can still have growth. We can still have prosperity. We can just do it by making it green. We don't have to cling to coal. We have to make sure that we do something about the people who depend on coal for a living, yes. So we need a just transition. But then we can see very clearly, and from some initiatives that UNDP has worked on, that green jobs are the wave of the future, whether it's working in renewable energy, sustainable tourism, or nature protection. We work in a lot of countries to say, okay, we would rather have the local community believe that it has a better chance at earning a good living from protecting the nature and bringing tourists to see that beautiful nature than from cutting down all the trees for heating. So that's a second cause of hope. Third, I hope that, I have spent a lot of time in pandemic lockdown thinking about what's important. And I think that this is a global phenomenon, that a lot of people have taken stock of their lives and said, okay, what do I really need and what do I value? And I think we will see a shift away from sort of the plastic-driven aspirations to more spiritual ones. And finally, you know, and here I come back to my introductory remark, you know, I see hope in the spirit of cooperation. You know, I think it's hard often, you know, where we see so many country-to-country rivalries and even conflicts. But I think, you know, what we need to do is start by sharing the success stories. Turkey has success stories, UK has success stories. There are lots of success stories and we can all learn from each other. And if we build on that, that productive spirit, I think there is reason to hope, even if we are hearing the gongs of midnight start to sound.
Evet, bu kadar karanlık bir konuya ancak bu kadar
This was a very dark issue, but you are very sympathetic and very positive about such a dark issue. You are filling us with hope and you are causing flowers blooming inside us. And thank you very much for that. Again, my question is to the Sir, distinguished ambassador. This year, global combat against climate change is particularly important. Paris Agreement was adopted 5 years ago, and now it's time to put it in practice. As the UK, this year, you will host an important global climate conference, COP26, in November. So what is this conference an important item on the global agenda? What are your preparations? What is your role? What are you aiming to achieve in this conference? Is there any challenge and is it possible to progress smoothly? Will we be able to breathe a sigh of relief as the global community from now on?
Gosh, well, it's this role that we have volunteered for as the host of COP26, the climate meeting in Glasgow in November, is a very challenging one. The way the international community works on climate is not through coercion, but by encouragement and persuasion. And we will have nearly 200 countries represented in Glasgow. And we have, as the president-elect and host of the meeting, it will be our responsibility to try and coordinate a common position for those nearly 200 countries without actually having a stick that we can shake at any of them. They all have to come to the same position because they want to. And that's going to be difficult. But the aim at Glasgow can be put pretty simply. It is this, that Paris set the objective. The objective is to keep global warming to below 2 degrees, and if possible, to 1.5 degrees Celsius, by reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that stay in the atmosphere and produce the greenhouse effect that the scientists know all about and have explained to us. So it's essentially, it's about action to reduce emissions, to adapt to the changes that are already happening, and to help with the just transition that Louisa mentioned earlier. So how are we going to get to the goal of keeping global warming to below 2 degrees centigrade? Well, if every country implements the commitments and promises it has made now, we will not get to 2 degrees. The global warming will be well above 2 degrees within a couple of decades. We therefore have to together acknowledge that although many of us feel we're making terrific efforts, that collectively it's just not enough and we need to do more together. So that's the first thing is the honesty and the humility for these nearly 200 countries to come together and say, yes, we have been trying hard, but it's really not good enough, because when we look at the graphs and the projections for global warming and the amount of greenhouse gases that our economies continue to emit, we know that we're not going to achieve what we said would be our goal at Paris. So the first thing at Glasgow is to address what is being called the mitigation gap, i.e. the gap between our goal and our actions to achieve that goal. And that means that each of those nearly 200 countries has got to say, yes, we will do more. We will be more ambitious in reducing greenhouse gases. That's our first task. Our second task at Glasgow is for people to acknowledge as well that they're already suffering harm from global warming. As Louise has been saying, these extreme weather events that are now becoming more and more common, the displacement, the flooding, the storms, etc., etc. And people need help to adapt. And I think there's perhaps a greater responsibility on the richer countries to work. It's not always a question of money, but to work with international organizations and with other governments to help those countries prepare themselves to be stronger and more resilient to deal with the effects of global warming and climate change. The third big area is all of this costs money, and the richer countries must make commitments to raise the finance necessary to help developing countries make the transition to a clean, green future, which on their own it would not be reasonable to expect them to be able to do, given their state of development. And we've set a target of raising $100 billion per year going forward in order to help with the just transition. And we've not yet raised in a single year anything like $100 billion. So we're asking people to put their hands deeper into their pockets and make an even greater effort at a time when their economies will have been taking a big hit from the COVID pandemic. So in some ways, if you take my own country, GDP in the UK reduced by 10% last year because of the restrictions associated with the pandemic and the virus. So we are doing our best now to grow back our economy at the same time as we're telling the world, and have to lead by example, we've got to find more money for the climate emergency that we're in. It's not easy, that's a difficult message, but we have to press that very hard. And then the last area, the fourth big area, is about collaboration and generating a sense of working together. There's an obvious point to make, which is we all share the planet. There is no planet B, there's just the planet that we're on. The greenhouse gases that are circulating up in the atmosphere, they don't distinguish between international borders. So it doesn't matter where they're being produced, they affect us all as they swirl around in the atmosphere. So we all recognize, I'm sure, that we're all affected and we must all work together to deal with the effects. And I think generating that sense of common purpose and common direction and common urgency will be an important goal at Glasgow as well. Now, will we succeed? You said, will we be able to breathe with greater relief at the end of it? Will we be able to say, phew, we've done it at Glasgow? I wish I could say yes. But I think, to be honest, I'm sure Glasgow will make good progress in the right direction because I think there is growing awareness in countries that have been maybe a bit reluctant to admit the nature of the problem before. Countries like China and India, the change of administration in the United States. Well, there are a number of things which point to the atmosphere getting more conducive to what I would call a responsible conversation about the planet and what we have to do. So I think we will make progress. But to be brutally frank, the measures that we have to take to achieve the Paris goals are so stretching and difficult, I think to persuade everybody to do what is necessary between now and November is probably expecting too much. But we can all make greater efforts. And then we don't stop in November. That's the other thing, that after the Glasgow meeting, we have to go on and we have to keep trying harder and harder. And we hope that cumulatively, within a relatively short time, we will both have developed the technologies and produced the good examples of success and generated sufficient sense of common purpose and fairness in how we tackle climate change, that everybody wants to do their bit very much to their best ability. So I think after Paris, there was a feeling that it had been a great achievement, which it had been a great achievement, and a great achievement for French diplomacy as well. And I'm hoping after Glasgow, people will also feel, yes, we have really achieved something, but there is still a lot more to do. And I think that's where I hope we'll be after Glasgow.
Çok teşekkür ediyorum. Yine kapsamlı ve güzel
Thank you
cevabı.
so much for your comprehensive and nice answer. We are trying to adopt. But on the other hand, how can we mitigate risks? We all know about the basic facts. Greenhouse gas emissions should be decreased. 1.5 degrees issue, etc., as mentioned by the distinguished ambassador. How could it be possible to realize these in Turkey and other countries about to move from the level of developing country to the level of developed country? This is my question for Louise now.
Thank you so much for a very, very tough question. I think this is, you know, like the UK government, UNDP has had to say, okay, what is the biggest crisis in front of us? And we've come to the similar conclusion. So really coming up with answers, but practical answers to your question is at the heart of UNDP's work in Turkey, but also everywhere else that we work. So, and I think the point is that we need to support efforts on both sides of the equation. So the mitigation part, which is reducing the emissions that cause climate change, and the adaptation part, which is preparing individuals, communities, regions, and entire countries to manage the risks that come with climate change. So, you know, one big area of our work, and one that I think helps to move the discussion forward and helps to, you know, create a community of like-minded actors is supporting on reporting on the commitments that countries have made to reduce their emissions. Somebody has to look at what's actually being done, measure it, and say, okay, have we done it? Do we need to do more? How do we do that? And then also medium-term and long-term planning. This is an area where I think it's typical for UNDP support, almost every country where UNDP works, is to support the national partners to come up with the plans, the strategies to reduce emissions, and then to look at how well they're doing and take a sober accounting of how really, what actions need to be taken to have what we call as a low emission development strategy or a low emission path. So this is both, you know, something we've done for the current strategies, but also we're looking ahead to support midterm strategy to 2030 and long-term strategy to 2050. So we have net zero by 2050 for everybody. So it's quite ambitious, but quite tricky work. And here I just want to say that, you know, one of the big challenges I think governments face is to ensure that planning of this sort is not just words on paper. You know, in the past, I think countries could get away with saying, okay, we recognize the dangers. We've done a strategy, we've declared our commitment, and then the big document is put on the shelf. That won't get us anywhere. So in UNDP, we like to support governments to cooperate. You know, it can't just be something designated to the Ministry of Environment, that you take care of this and then it's done. It needs to be something that's spread across all ministries, then all, you know, sort of municipalities, all regions, and then private sector. And so it's something that really is quite a significant undertaking for any government to ensure that this is policies that are actually pursued in the integrated way that they're supposed to. So where UNDP can provide support, that's something that we work on a lot. And I think that's quite a standard for what we do. But then I think also I would point to more specific programs, and many of these we're doing with the support of the British government. So thank you very much for that ability. For example, you know, we have a program here to experiment with solar power for remote villages, for villages in forests, you know, to show the potential of solar power for power generation. We have work on energy efficient engines in industry. So to shift from an older sort of high carbon approach to engines to an energy efficient one. And as I mentioned, you know, almost everywhere we are working on nature protection so that we don't destroy more of the environment that operates as what we call carbon sink, that keeps us safe from carbon. That's on the mitigation side, but then on the adaptation side, you know, as I said, you know, my picture of doom and gloom of floods and hail and torrential rain and drought and pests and famine, you know, every country needs to work more on reducing the risk of disasters. And a lot of this comes with having an informed public, having an early warning system, but it also comes from what we're finding more and more from having nature-based solutions, nature-based approaches that work with nature instead of trying to block nature. And what I mean by this, I've seen a very real example of this, of restoring wetlands. So, you know, this comes from my past experience in Macedonia, but, you know, we had a very real situation where, you know, a lake was being polluted by a lot of effluent from industry, from sewage. And what we said is, look, if you restore the wetland, then you don't have to build a wastewater treatment plant. So you gain back nature, you gain birds, you gain cattails that villagers could cut for renewable energy, but you don't have to plant a wastewater treatment plant if you leave the wetlands in place. So that's one example, but there are many. When you start to think about it, you see that if nature is on our side, we are much better prepared for the threats of climate change. We also, you know, very much believe that you need to infuse what we call climate awareness into everything that's done by anybody. So, for example, we're now working here on sustainable tourism. So the idea is to make people aware of the damage that can be done to the environment, but also to celebrate environmental protection as a tourist attraction. This is, I think, a big opportunity for Turkey, you know, with all the seas and the brilliant blue waters, that protecting that is more valuable than sort of destroying it by building too many hotels and allowing too many. There's also a need to show the evidence. So Sir Dominic referred to the huge amount of money that needs to be mobilized to reach this 100 billion a year target. But if we look at fossil fuel subsidies that governments are spending now in a real way, that dwarfs that 100 billion amount. So what we can do is persuade people to stop incentivizing the use of fossil fuels and shift those incentives to renewable energy. And that's one of the solutions we're hoping for very, very much. And I think, as I said, you know, we really do see huge opportunity in green growth or green jobs, you know, in all of these sectors, in, you know, even retraining technicians to build and install hot water, solar power. There's a whole range of potential for creating jobs by taking green options. And finally, you know, we come to this sphere of awareness and advocacy where, you know, as has already been said, you know, we need to change behavior, not just governmental policies or governmental leadership, which is very, very important, but everyone needs to change how he or she relates to plastics, you know, to waste, to energy. My sense is that most people want to do something and they may be aware of the need, but they feel a bit powerless. They feel a bit helpless. So we need to give them the examples of what they can do. And we need to speak in nouns and verbs, in real world language, which brings me back to you, Mert, to really thank you for the role that you play in conveying to people the urgency of collective, but also individual action and changing their behaviors. So really it comes back to you and the difference you can make by speaking in real world language to people to encourage them that change is needed and it's needed now. Thanks.
Çok teşekkür ediyorum.
Thank you very much for all your nice words. And thank you very much for mentioning the role and involving me in. And if we are doing something about culture and arts, if we are acting, we are also those who are the voices of the community. This is why we are doing it. It's not only about seeming nice on the screen, looking nice on the screen. Distinguished ambassador, as you mentioned, there is no planet B. We are a part of this planet and we are responsible to protect this environment, this planet, this heritage. We are one of the important actors in this sense. Thank you very much for giving this role to me. And I would like to thank UNDP once again for making me the Goodwill Ambassador. So I am moving to the last questions. You have been serving as the ambassador in Turkey for a couple of years, distinguished ambassador. As I indicated before, climate change has been affecting us very adversely. For instance, we experience deadly floods every year. This year, we have experienced a decrease in snow and rainfall. Normally, in April and in May, we used to have high rainfall in central Anatolia, but now we have the risk of drought. So what are your impressions when you consider all participants and not only the government? Is Turkey already on the right track, or does it have to exercise more efforts to fight against climate change? As the ambassador, what would you say about it? As the embassy, do you support Turkey in this regard? What are you doing to support Turkey? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And you know, I'm an observer here. I'm a foreign observer in what goes on in this country, and I recognize the national sovereignty and the right of the Turkish society and the Turkish government to make their own decisions. So it's within that framework that I will answer the questions, which are good questions and interesting questions. I think Turkey has, I guess, so what I'm going to say are probably four points, two of which are positive, one of which is neutral, and one of which is an opportunity. So the two positive ones, first of all, I agree with Louisa about what she said about awareness and the fact that I think awareness of the dangers of climate change and global warming has grown very quickly in Turkey in the last few years. I think it's partly because you have sadly suffered some very extreme weather events, and the number of those extreme weather events, I think last year was more than in any previous year. So these are becoming more common and more dangerous and more harmful. That's not a good thing, but it does mean that people can't ignore the problem. And so there is a much more constructive discussion and greater awareness of the issue. I think also because you have a young population, I think that makes a difference as well, because for young people, this isn't, you know, the fact that this is something which is going to could get progressively more difficult for all of us over 10, 20, 30-year time horizon. You know, for some of us, people like me, you know, I'll be in my dotage in 20 years' time. So, you know, selfishly, I could just enjoy myself the next 20 years and burn up a lot of carbon and have a party. That's not a responsible way to behave, and I'm not going to do that, by the way. But if you're a young person, you know, you've got 50, 60 plus years life ahead of you. You know, this is really going to wreck your life if we don't get this right. And the lives of your friends and your, you know, and your children's lives and your, let alone grandchildren. So this is really, really important. I think Turkey having a younger population on average than many other countries is helpful to generating in society a sense this is a matter that really has to be addressed seriously, and we really need to make sacrifices and a great effort to achieve what we need to achieve. So that's good. So the awareness is good in Turkey and getting better all the time. I think there are some real strengths in the performance of Turkish society and the government. I see the leadership given by the First Lady on waste management. I think that's a really good signal that we're getting from the Presidency's office. We're getting a very strong message about recycling, about limiting personal waste, and about lots of personal choices that we need to make. That's excellent. I think the record on forestry or forestation in Turkey is amazing. I was here as a baby diplomat 35 years ago, and I remember when we drove around the Anatolian plateau, you never saw a tree, or you rarely saw a tree. Sometimes you knew you were coming to a village because in the distance you could see a few trees, but generally there was a bare landscape. Nowadays, you drive between Istanbul and Ankara, you know, most of the journey, there are forests either side of you. If you fly over the country, you look down on it and you see this great green forested area, which didn't exist 35 years ago, largely. So I think there's been a tremendous effort on forestation, and, you know, congratulations to everybody who's been involved in that. I think a third area of strength is the drive for clean energy. I mean, Turkey's had hydro for a long time, and I know there's a bit of a debate about how clean hydro should be considered, but it's always had hydro because of the rivers and the mountains. But now we're seeing Turkey investing much more in wind and in solar and that's wholly to be commended. And they're showing an interest in some of the advanced nuclear plants as well. And, that's also a clean source of power, which will be necessary if we're to achieve the net zero emissions targets that we should be setting ourselves. So I think, again, on renewable energy, you have to commend the government for recognizing it needs to point in that direction and is investing to make progress. And of course, you have advantages here. I mean, you do have a lot of space. There is space for solar farms, there is space for wind farms, and it's good to see the priority there being given. Now that's number two. I think on the third issue, with a more neutral issue, which I would describe as work in progress, is Turkey's participation in the international structures, this sense of collaboration with everybody else, because Turkey is one of the very few countries that has not yet ratified the Paris Treaty. And that's quite a big thing. I can't remember who the other countries are who've not yet ratified it, but there are only a handful, and it's not normally the sort of countries you want to be, in the company of, as a serious major modern developed country. So I think there is that question about the Paris Treaty. I think also we will be hoping, as the COP26 host this year, to encourage the government to set more ambitious targets for emissions reductions. And again, I think there's work to be done there in Turkey, but Turkey's not the only country. There are lots of countries that need to set more ambitious targets, but we'll be encouraging Turkey to do that as well. I think there's a rather technical issue about Turkey's status under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where it's categorized for some purposes as a developed country, which means it doesn't have access to the Green Climate Fund. So there's a particular issue that we as Britain are working with Turkey on over the next year, as we run up to Glasgow in particular, to try and solve this issue of making sure Turkey has fair access to funds to help it make the transition to a low carbon economy. And that is work in progress, and I'm sure I'm reasonably confident that we'll find a way to make a fair offer to Turkey before we get to Glasgow. So those, I think, are all the areas where there is work in progress. And then the last area where I think I see a big opportunity is for Turkish manufacturing. Turkey's developed a very large and very diversified manufacturing industry, largely in the west of the country, through and because of its customs union with the European Union, where you have a huge market of, 360 million people, very, very, very large number of people. And Turkey has the advantage of lower overheads, a highly skilled labor force, plenty of space, and tariff-free, quota-free access into the European market to sell its goods. As European countries decarbonize their economies, they're going to need new goods. And it seems to me there's going to be a big demand for the right sort of low carbon, green, clean manufactured components, both in households and in factories, and generally in economies over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And I can't think of anywhere better placed than Turkey to be manufacturing those kinds of goods. So if organizations like TÜSİAD, the employers organization, I think are very much aware of the opportunity for Turkey here. And I think if Turkey really aligns itself with major efforts under the Paris Treaty to achieve the greenhouse gas emissions reductions that we all want to see, that will really support the reputation of Turkey as a country from which the European markets that will wish to source the goods of the future that they need and to invest in Turkey to make those goods for the future. And I think that looks like a really tremendous opportunity for the Turkish economy. And maybe that'll be one of the ways in which Turkey will be able to cut emissions and drive forward growth at the same time. So I'm, with smart policies in place, which is the key to all of this, the government puts smart policies in place, sets ambitious targets for itself, and it takes the steps, builds on the foundation it already has on waste management, forestation, clean energy, and these other areas, then as an ambassador here, I can write very positive reports back to my host capital or my home capital and tell them, we want to work with Turkey as a partner on climate change, which we do. We genuinely do. I don't just say that. We want to work with Turkey as a partner, and we have a good prospect of really making a difference through this partnership.
Çok teşekkür ediyorum her iki konuğuma da.
Thank you very much, both distinguished speakers. Thank you very much. It has been a wonderful, a very fruitful discussion. It's a really exciting one for all the climateers. You mentioned wonderful things. You mentioned this $100 billion target, and it has not been completed yet. And you mentioned the fundraising altogether, and there have been some wonderful opportunities for Turkey, as far as I can understand. There are those partnerships already been implemented. There are still some common aims that we need to work through together. And you also mentioned the young population in Turkey as a great advantage. Just like you said beforehand, there is no plan B, there is no planet B. We have only one planet, and we are very aware of that as young people. And you also mentioned the meaningful consumption. You mentioned the awareness raising. You said that the young people will not only consume, but they'll also be a part of the generation, the production of what they are consuming. And you also indicated the green jobs, the green market, the green economy. And this will be also a great opportunity for the young population in the future who would like to be employed in some important occupations of the future. This is a very big hope for the future of Turkey. Thank you very much for putting this forward. As long as we work together, we realize that there is still many resources that we can utilize in terms of human resources and other natural resources. And also there are the green credits, green loans of different organizations. There are those financing parts, universities, and actually we have everything. We have each and every kind of resource, and we just need to make sure that we use them. As mentioned by Luisa and Dominic, we need to set common targets. We need to sit together around the round table, and we need to make sure that both individually and collectively, we change our behaviors. Let's get green together. Let's stay healthy and hopeful for future. We are towards the end of our event. If there is nothing further you would like to add, unfortunately, I need to say goodbye now. I am saying unfortunately because this is a very good conversation, but we are in the decade of action. So we need to speed it up. We need to get into the action. And while concluding my words, I would like to invite my distinguished friends and climateers to an event. We will organize Conversations in Climate-ish welcoming summer event on 21st of June to close the season. And as mentioned by the resident representative, we will be talking about the behaviors and what we can do to not to have a hotter, a warmer summer the next season. So we would like to see all of our friends over there in the event with us. Thank you very much for watching us. Thank you very much for being responsible. Thank you very much for taking initiatives. Thank you very much for being with us in the decade of action. Thank you very much for following up on the 17 goals and the sub-activities, 169 of those. And thank you very much for not leaving anyone behind. Hope to see you later on.